Now, there's a whole series of best practices around due diligence, and I want to spend a little bit of time on these. We do have a lot more slides in the PowerPoint. Some of these slides we won't get to. We typically don't, but we'll be working with Firmex to share kind of a handout version of the PowerPoint that'll include even some of the slides that we didn't get to. But this is an important one. I want to spend a few minutes on it, and I want to make sure we get to any additional questions that have come up. One of the biggest problems I see in due diligence is when it's not coordinated. What I mean by that is that the two sides are not working with a clear quarterback or captain. So what's happening is the lawyers are talking to the lawyers, the accountants are talking to the accountants, the investment bankers are talking to each other, but nobody's sharing that information with each other at the end of the day. Nobody's in charge of the strategy or truly in charge of the strategy for resolving due diligence disputes at the end of the day, or information that's inconsistent. And that just turns into a huge mess. Yes, teamwork's important, but have a clear captain or quarterback for each side and for each party to the transaction. And as all of you know from our last webinar, or all of you know from your own experience, it's not, it's not just the buyer and the seller. We were on a conference call recently on a transaction we're working on right now. There were 9 different parties with 9 different sets of lawyers on the call. My guy, the CEO of the company, called me afterwards. He says, I don't think I've ever spent so much money simultaneous on one phone call, which I didn't think he meant as a compliment, but he was basically observing just how many, chefs there were in the kitchen, because there's 2 different sources of acquisition finance. There's 3 different sets of shareholders. There's an ESOP and their counsel. We talked a little bit about this in the October session. When you have multiple parties on each side of the transaction, all the more reason the due diligence process needs to be well managed, and that each party has a point of contact, a clear quarterback, and that there's a very definite coordination and collaboration process in place. The more you know, the better questions you can ask. The more you're understanding to the concerns of other disciplines, the better questions you can ask. I'm not an expert in forensic accounting, but I try and spend time with people that are, so that they can train me to ask better questions and be a better lawyer around and uncovering problems that might come up. We've talked about the importance of being organized, bringing in industry experts where they're necessary, whether that's on market trends, whether that's on understanding the consumer, whether that's on the trends within that particular industry vertical. We've talked about the importance of using technological tools, the search engines, the data rooms, the Web 2.0 stuff. All of those can be a very, very effective augmentation to the traditional response to due diligence that's going to be posited either at once or on a phased basis into the data room. Developing penalties, consequences, remedies for noncompliance or late compliance, even though there is that strategic phasing issue that was brought up by Laura's question. We've talked about understanding why a party may be trying to hide key facts, and then the importance of being inquisitive. Joel, what I thought I'd do, since we only have about 8-9 minutes left, let me pose a question to you that's very relevant in due diligence so that the audience gets to hear it. But since we know that virtually every M&A transaction of any size today will have a data room, are there 3 or 4 things that you want to share at this point, or even advance to the appropriate slide, that our community of listeners should know about appropriate data room tools? Because I think some of these slides we're skipping through are things that we can share. They're just more specific on due diligence, but I think it's important that we look at what a virtual data room is and learn some of the best practices around them.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I'll be quick because there's a bunch more questions that I think some people would like to pose here we've got on the list. But I think the concept of a virtual data room has to move away from the sort of periodic use to something that any deal-centric organization should make part of their infrastructure. And the reason for that is that rather than hurriedly assembling one at the last minute, they can really get ahead of the process and be transparent up front, which will really, and organized, which will really make the whole diligence process a lot friendlier, and there'll be less surprises. And we've seen this with more and more organizations that understand that, hey, we're in the age of the internet, and we are, whether it's a M&A deal or a financing or simply swapping land packages between resource companies, where they're doing lots of small transactions, joint ventures, any type of sharing of confidential documents, and certainly volumes of confidential documents between parties. In fact, I was talking to a client in New Mexico who happens to be a small law firm, and the bank they deal with today has a new policy that they will not email commercial loan documents. Wow. And they said, do you have a data room facility, because we can't work with you unless you do. And we're not talking about so large ones, but 7 or 8 documents. Most of these are small, medium-sized business operating loans backed by some kind of collateral. And so I think that the concept of data room has to expand beyond simply M&A, but more broadly to financial transactions, and what we're seeing as well as financial compliance. So both intermediaries and corporations are using it for whether they report to some regulator or internal or board or committee or whatever it is. So, and it's or in fact they're auditors. We see a lot of financial audits being done on data room, and the difference is Firmex offers an unlimited use data room. So the more our clients use it for multi-purpose or multi-transactional environments, the more useful it is. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and also, from a security perspective, I got 2 emails this week that I wasn't supposed to get, and I think with the age of smartphones and whatnot, we do wing around our email a lot, and sometimes we send things that we're not supposed to get. And so I think you really have to make it a best practice of your organization if you're a deal-centric organization. So whether you're a law firm or you're a bank, private equity firm, or a corporation that does 3 or 4 transactions or an annual audit with your auditors a year. So I think you're going to see it more and more.
Yeah, I think those are great points. One sort of follow-up question I have, because I have to have a follow-up question after all that lecturing I gave about the importance of a follow-up question. Are there 3 or 4 things, objectively speaking, are there 3 or 4 things that a consumer of virtual data room services should be looking for as a matter of best practice? Things that if the data room provider doesn't offer X, Y, and Z, then you really have got to look elsewhere, because it's going to screw up the transaction.
Actually, the only thing you got to be really careful. I mean, most data rooms are, and I'll be pretty transparent here. Most of them are pretty good, right? They'll get the job done. The biggest problem with most data room offerings is they charge per page. And if you actually look at the financial documents of some of the publicly traded ones, 2/3 of their revenue are from overages, which are sort of end-of-deal surprises. Oh, well, by the way, you went over your page limit, and there's a surcharge or this, and oh, you added this many extra users, and there's another surcharge. And next thing you know, 2/3 of the bill comes after the fact. They get away with it because, when the transaction's done, it seems like a rounding error. But it is a surprise, and we get a lot of complaints to new customers who've come over. So I think you really want to look for a data room that's kind of like the diligence process, transparent up front about how they're going to bill for it. Get one that's unlimited use. Get one that's an organization that has a SAS 70 cert, some kind of compliance with your confidential information. I think that's really important. And the other
I think that's very helpful, because if you're too focused on the technology itself and not focused enough on pricing and service offerings and things around the technology, then you're right. You're going you're going to get pulled into technical questions and forget that
Right.
that the technology may have certain core capabilities, but a lot of it is also about the business model of the provider.
Yeah. Yeah, the final one is make sure, I mean, we're in North America, but the 24/7 support is domestic. We get complaints of other providers where, you know, they call at 1 in the morning and they, next thing you know, they're in Mumbai and the person doesn't really understand how the thing works, and they just basically pick up the phone. So those are I'd say the 3 things you want to look out for. Elizabeth, Andrew, if you got just a second, we've got a couple more minutes. There's some questions up flying in here that I'd love to give our audience a chance.
Of course.
Yeah, I have a great question from Colin. Really back to your point, Andrew, around the team and the quarterback on the team, and how does that, what's the right composition of that team? Colin asked a question asking, once a company is 75% of the way to selling a portion of a business, would it be better to stay with the intermediary through to the close, or would it be better to shift and assign the task to an internal executive to manage the close?
Good question. I think that it goes back to a comment I made early in the session about what is the nature of the investment banker? Is their style more hands-on? Do they understand all the steps towards closing? Some investment bankers that I've interacted with are very good at spotting a potential transaction or seeing strategic fit, not so good at the details towards closing. Closing transactions is all about momentum and attention to detail. And so if the intermediary can take it through to the end, God bless. If it's not their core skill set and they're better off turning that process over to either somebody internally and or you know, the lawyer or whoever is qualified to play that quarterback role, it will vary. One thing I will urge, because it's a very good question Colin asked, is, you know, be honest about your skill set. I mean, if you're going to be a guy who's not heavy on attention to detail, who's not a good catalyst, don't volunteer to be the guy that brings the deal to closing, because, you know, it's going to derail more often than you'd like it to if that's not your skill set. If you've got good collaboration skills, if you've got good organizational skills, you're going to keep things, you know, momentum around the deal and timetables and enforcement of timetables and other key metrics, then, you know, you may be the right person to stay as the quarterback all the way through. Also, like in football, I mean, you need to have the respect of the rest of your team, or you're going to be an ineffective quarterback.
Great. Thanks so much. Unfortunately, we're right at 2 o'clock, and so even though we do have a couple of other questions in the queue, I'm going to do a quick wrap-up, and we'll try and follow up with everybody over email and on the blog within the next couple of days. So thanks so much again, Andrew, for a wonderful session, Joel, for all of your insights. Thanks to everybody who submitted a question and everybody who attended the class. Just to finally mention that 5 of you have been selected at random to receive a complimentary copy of one of Andrew's books. So we'll be in touch with you soon if you see your name here up on the slide. And you can tell us which book you prefer, and we'll have that sent off to you. And for those of you who'd like to review this masterclass again or who would like to share it with your colleagues, we'll be providing a link to the recording, a copy of the slides, and complimentary due diligence checklists from Andrew's book, The M&A Handbook of Due Diligence. And our next class in this series, our final class, will be held on December the 8th. And stay tuned for details on that. And thanks again, everybody, for attending today and participating.